Thank you. That was terrific. Katie, she was too modest to say that we met when she was on the Duke board. She came out shortly after graduation, and they select one person to come out from a class and represent the whole class on the board of trustees, and there she was. And she was spoke up, and I really was quite struck by how much she added. Graves, thank you for your introductions and your thank yous to all the people here. I told you I would not poke fun at you, any more fun at Princeton. But for a Princeton guy, you did pretty well. I also want to say, among all the many thank yous that are due here tonight, and I share all the ones that Graves mentioned. I'd like also to recognize my co-director, Max Bazerman, and his wife, Marla. Would you all stand, please? Max has been an extraordinary addition to the Kennedy School. Coming from the business school, he has a joint appointment now to the two, but he's lent himself in such magnificent ways to the center. We could not have made the progress that we have were it not for Max, and indeed for the addition of Patty Bellinger as our executive director. Many of you met Patty. She was not able, she's on her way to San Francisco tonight, but she was here earlier today. And I can just tell you that so much of what we have done in the last couple of years has been due to them coming in and strengthening our entire operation, strengthening our team. We have a wonderful team, as you've seen. And to be honest with you, it also gives me great assurances that the center will be in good hands for many years to come. And that's very important to us as we go forward with our work. So thank you, Max. And you've actually lent me a little intellectual credibility, not much, but some. And I appreciate that. I do want to apologize for Madeleine Albright, her inability to be here tonight. We talked last night. She was extremely sorry she couldn't join us. But she promised us she promised us a rain check. So we have a chit that's in safekeeping. Archon, you can look after that. Maybe we can get her to come up and be a graduation speaker, or we'll do something. Well, if nothing else, we'll get her to come up and raise money, right? We're on the constant hunt. But in any event, I was not looking to do this, but I got drafted by these good folks. And so I'm happy to talk to you for a little while. I don't want to bore you into hours late, and I know we have some dancing, and the bar will be open here in just a short while. As you heard from Katie, I have been around a rather long time. Some of my critics think way too long, but I've gotten to a stage in life right now where I'm very sympathetic with an old fellow who was walking through the woods one day, and he heard this sound, and he couldn't see anything, and then he heard it again, and looked down, and there was a frog by the side of the path, and the frog looked up at him and said, "If you kiss me, I'll turn into a beautiful princess." And he said, "Wow, that's terrific." Reached down, scoops up the frog, puts it in his pocket, no kiss. Well, the frog's very surprised, crawls up his jacket. "Didn't you hear me? I said, if you kiss me, I'll turn into a beautiful princess." "Yeah, I heard you all right, but at my age, I'd rather have a talking frog." That's sort of where I am in life right now. And most of the people I see in politics look like frogs anyway. So it's, yeah, with a great glowing exception of Seth Moulton, of course, who was on the front page of the Boston Globe. Even as we met today at lunch, there was Seth, a big story, great big picture of, he came back from Afghanistan and Iraq to be with us. He flew overnight to be with us. And so we're deeply grateful to him, and of course proud of him, as we are so proud of all of you. I wasn't quite sure what to do tonight. It would be, quote, my leadership journey. What I thought might be helpful or interesting, I don't know if it'd be interesting or not, but what I'd like to do is to take off on the conversation that Dean Williams was having with the panel, at lunchtime today. And, he first asked him, if you had to use one cuss word, what would it be? And we all sort of booed him off the stage on that. So then he asked, okay, if you had to have one word about leadership, about a quality of leadership, what would it be? So what I'd like to do is take off on that. There were 3 that we heard today, and then I'm going to trot out 7 more that matter to me in my leadership journey. So I want to give you the top 10. And let's start with where Mara was today at lunch. She said persistence, right? That was where you started. And I thought that That is an insight of somebody who's actually been out in the arena and understands how hard change is. You know, historically, people who have written the best books about politics and society, start with Machiavelli, famously said how hard change was. And that is because there are some people who benefit from the status quo and they're going to resist it. And there are other people who would benefit from change, but they're scared of it. And when you put those together, it's really hard to overcome that and mobilize people behind it. And it is, I think what you're going to find in life, as I have found, is the kind of changes that you want to see don't happen with the kind of speed that you'd like to see them. I was very involved in civil rights when I was young, and I just felt for sure by the time I died that this country would address racism, and that we not only would address racism, but that African Americans would have an equal shot in life. And here we are, years later, when neither of those propositions is true. And so, you know, and that's been a great disappointment to me as a white Southerner. But there we are. Now, what I would say, though, is this, and the good news is this: when change starts, it may be slow when it starts, but then it can become very quick. And there's no better example of this than our good friend Brian Elliott. So many of you remember him as one of the fellows here. And when Brian was passionate about gay rights when he was here on the Kennedy School campus. We spent a lot of time talking together. And when he went out, he formed his own organization to deal with that. And they made magnificent progress. You know, what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years has been unbelievable how rapidly that change has come. And it's come from one of our fellows really putting his shoulder to the wheel and making a big difference. I remember going to the Time Warner Center one night about 4 or 5 years ago, and there were 2 different receptions and going on at the Time Warner Center. And one was organized by Ry Barcott, who was here trying to get the Democratic Convention to come to Charlotte, and the other was organized by Brian Elliott. And they had these 2 Kennedy School former fellows who were up there doing that. I was so proud of what they were up to. But change is fundamentally very, very hard, and we know that. Now, number 9, we heard from Seth today, integrity. Now, I must tell you that there was a time in my life which I thought, yeah, obviously it's a given, but I was raised in an academic family. My dad was a math professor, chairman of the math department at Duke for a long time. And so when I was raised with the notion that the best leaders are the people who are the brightest and the people who are the most talented. If you find the brightest, most talented person, put that person in charge, you're going to get the best results. That's what I believed most of the years growing up. And then I went to work for Richard Nixon. And I learned differently. You know, Richard Nixon was one of the most talented people, one of the brightest people, best strategist I've ever met in American politics. Someone who was able to go up on a mountaintop and look sort of 20 years into the future and figure out how the world was going to evolve, and then try to, you know, to twist those forces or nudge those forces to favor American foreign policy interests. That's a remarkable talent. Came from his extraordinary travels and from his readings. And if that had been all there was to him, he would have been one of our more significant presidents. But what I rapidly learned as I got to know him, and he sort of let me closer into the circle, and I was just a kid, was that he had demons, that he had not learned to control, that there was this dark side. As my wife Ann will tell you, as Carl Jung makes the argument, that all of us have bright sides and we have dark sides, and one of the great challenges in life is how to master your dark side and integrate it into your bright side so that you are a more integrated whole person. He never learned to do that, and it brought him down. And it was the right thing to do for him to leave. It was going through that was a bit like going through the Marines. And frankly, those of us who were in that Nixon White House, that Nixon entourage, felt that we were finished in American public life. It was like playing for the Chicago Black Sox. That was our sense of things. But fortunately, contrary to Scott Fitzgerald, there are second chances in American life, and some of us were able to make comebacks. But I was forever seared by that experience, and came to understand that actually character is a heck of a lot more important, and you better start there. And if you don't get that one right, everything else, Alan Simpson, when he came to the Kennedy School, introduced Jerry Ford one day. He said, if you have integrity, nothing else matters. I don't think that's quite true, but if you have integrity, nothing else matters. If you don't have integrity, nothing else matters. Pretty interesting way to think about things. So I rank that right up there. Number 8. And what we heard from Jay about, and I wanted him to come up and dance tonight before I spoke. I thought it would put us all in the right mood. But he talked about humility. And I thought, well, that was a terrific way to end that particular series. Because what I have discovered so often is that you have to stay anchored to be a leader. And frequently, it's your partner or your spouse or your best friend. In my case, my wife tries to keep me anchored. She pierces my balloon regularly when my head gets too big, and she comes along and says, well, you didn't carry out the track. And that helps. It actually keeps me sort of more in perspective. And I would suggest that for many of you, that it's really equally important to stay anchored, because you're going to be more and more successful. There's nobody in this room who's going to have trouble sort of earning a living. You're all going to do very, very well with that, and you're going to be, we already can see you're making enormous contributions already, but you're going to be more and more successful, and you'll get good headlines frequently on your way up, and it can really go to your head. I've seen all sorts of cases in Washington in which people come and they're like meteors across the sky. They flame out. You can just tell it. They've got a much bigger opinion of themselves than they should, and they go down. They go down like that. It's really because they're not particularly anchored. I would also suggest one other aspect of this question of humility. We haven't had anyone who's been perfect as a person as president since George Washington. Every one of our presidents since then, and I would argue I have never met anybody in politics or public life, nonprofit world and business world included, who was a perfect human being. All of us have skeletons in our closet. All of us have weaknesses. George Stephanopoulos wrote a book about Bill Clinton called Altogether Too Human, which captured him, and I thought pretty well. And I think what's important to life about that is that you accept the fact that you're not perfect, but that you try to work on it as best you can. That's what Nelson Mandela has said frequently about his own life, that he every day tries to, while he was still alive, he said every day he got up and tried to get better. I once had an interview with Taylor Branch, who I interviewed him on McNeil-Lehrer, and it was when he'd just written, I think, the second volume of his 3-volume biography of Martin Luther King Jr. And by my lights, Martin Luther King Jr. was America's greatest moral leader of the 20th century. I thought he really did more to lift the quality of life in this country than anyone else we could see out there. And yet, he, as you know, he had a chaotic personal life. He was in many ways, he did not set a personal example, as more and more books have come out about all that. And I asked Taylor, so how do you square the fact that King was such a moral leader with his personal life? And he said, you got to understand two things about it. One was, he always told us, I'm not as good as you think I am. He understood, he was working on it, but he also he didn't try to be something he was not. He was not hypocritical about that. And then he said something very else. He said, I think that King actually put himself frequently, in compensation for what he thought his weaknesses were, he frequently put himself in greater danger than he would have otherwise. That was an interesting insight. And I would argue knowing your weakness can often help you compensate in a different way to try to deal with some of what you're dealing with. So don't be afraid of being your weaknesses. Try to deal with them and understand them and accept that humility. Number 7, passion. I, from my own experience, do believe very strongly that you need to listen to your inner voice about what you're doing. Bill George, if Bill George was here, and so many of you got to know him through his fellowship, through his teaching, through True North, which is one of the most popular, second most popular, first most popular course at the business school now. We have Dana Bourne, who has come in from the Air Force Academy, the first woman to become a general while at one of the academies. She's now on our faculty at the Kennedy School. She's part of our center, a beloved part of our center. They argue the case for True North. And I've come to really believe that, and I've heard so often reflected in your comments today about how you now accept the fact and you've embraced the fact that leadership starts from within, and that you have to get yourself sort of squared before you can lead others very well. And part of that is about that inner voice. When I was growing up, I started out, well, frankly, I used to play a lot of sports, and then I was about 14 or so, and I gained like 6 or 8 inches in a year, and I totally lost coordination. I was like terrible. I continued to play baseball, and I remember trying out for the high school baseball team, and we did it in the gym, and I threw I was very good at baseball before I grew up, and I threw this hard pitch, and it went straight through a window. Didn't hit the catcher, didn't come anywhere close to the catcher. It went through a window on the 2nd floor. At that point, I said, I'm finished. I cannot play athletics, and I became a sports writer. And I started working for the local newspaper, and I eventually started working on public city news, and I started with obituaries and city news and state news. And I had a wonderful time, and it really introduced me to public life, which I enjoyed. I had a beat. We just talked to the mayor all the time. I talked to the city manager, and I was 16, 17 years old. It was just 18 or 19, I went and covered Khrushchev coming to Washington. It was wonderful. And then I also got, and we had a mayor in North Carolina by the name of Terry Sanford. And he was very much like John Kennedy. He had this sort of passion that he called forth a lot of us to go into public service. And I went to work for him as an intern, and then through a good friend named Joel Flashman, and then wound up working on civil rights for Terry. And he was a very progressive governor, and we worked on education and race relations. And I drove 2 or 3 summers, drove a fellow named Dave Coltrane all around the state. I was driving Mr. Dave. And worked with him on setting up good neighbor councils. And it was enormously fulfilling for me. In fact, I look back and think that of all the things I did in Washington, the single most fulfilling thing I did in public life, working in government, was actually to work for Terry Sanford back in our state. And then I went on to the law school, and I went out and worked for a law firm one summer, and I hated it. It was great. It was a Wall Street firm. It was on the 55th floor, had this gorgeous view. They were offering me all sorts of money to come back and one thing and another, but it was boring as hell. It was just like, I just didn't care who won, because it didn't seem to be very consequential. And I realized I can't do that. And so that's what led it led me on a different path. And I really believe in that you've got to try that. And that's what Bill George argues so much. There's a wonderful quote from William James that I think really speaks to this. He said, seek not that particular mental attribute which makes you feel, seek out that particular mental attribute which makes you feel most deeply an inner alive, along with which the inner voice says, this is the real me. This is the real me. And when you have found that attitude, follow it. I think that is so, and that just seems to me to fit so many of you so well about finding your inner voice. When you're most truly alive, you'll know it, and stick with that. And I don't think you can plan out your lives at this stage. You can't plan what you're going to do next. But what I do think what you'll find is, and it was interesting when we took a group of fellows to Washington some years ago, and Barack Obama was a senator at that time, and Samantha Power got our fellows in to see Obama, and people asked him, well, how should I plan my life so I can be a senator or something like you? And he said, don't plan your jobs. Find your passion, and the jobs will find you. I think that's right. I really think that was very good advice from him. Number 6, curiosity. We live in an extraordinarily relentlessly changing world. At West Point, they use an acronym now to train the future officers about what the world is going to be like that they're entering. It's called VUCA, it's V-U-C-A, and it stands for volatility, uncertainty, chaos, and ambiguity. That well describes the world that you're going to find yourself in. And the only way you can keep up with it is to be curious about it, to understand it, to read deeply, and to read, and to read, and to read, and also to talk to people and understand, to go out and see them. One of the reasons I liked these fellowship trips is they get you out of the classrooms, onto the streets, on to places like San Antonio or Jackson, Mississippi, a group just came back from, wanted to go there, or New York City or Silicon Valley, wherever it is. But that really helps educate you in a different way. All of us learn in a different way. But I cannot also underemphasize the importance of continuous reading and self-education. If you go back and look at the biographies of someone like Teddy Roosevelt, he read a book a day while he was president. Owen Wister, who wrote The Virginian, he wrote it later on about coming to see Teddy in the White House around 5 o'clock in an afternoon, giving him a copy of his new book, The Virginian. They then had dinner. Their dinner went on with a whole group of people, a sort of a salon-like dinner. It went on for 3 or 4 hours that night. They had breakfast the next day, and TR had read the book, and they sat down and had a serious conversation about it. And you'll look at Churchill and how he wanted to become self-educated and sent for, his mother used to send truckloads of books into India. It's really important to understand that. If you have a chance, one of the most moving moments I had was in visiting presidential libraries. And I love this library. And one day, come back and do see the exhibit downstairs. Heather Campion, who used to be at the Kennedy School, now runs a library, and it's a terrific exhibit. And Deepak goes perfectly with what he was doing and saying today. But Harry Truman's library, it's very interesting. He was the only president in the 20th century who never went to college. His family was too poor when he came out of high school. He wound up working 7 years behind a mule on the family farm. But during that time, he became self-educated. And he turned out to be one of the best educated presidents we've ever had. There are long stories connected with that. But there was a high school group that came to see Truman. I saw a copy of Truman's talk to this high school group. And Truman said, not every reader is a leader, but every leader is a reader. I think there's soundness in that, which I would urge upon you and to keep thinking about that. Number 5 is empathy. Warren Bennis, our good friend who died here in the last year, it was a big loss for those of us at the center. He'd been our spiritual father, as you've heard from so many. But he used to write about what he called deep listening. And that is the whole notion that you need to learn how to listen to people, but it's also important to hear what they're really saying. It's not just the words they're telling you, it's what they're really saying behind that. When I was editor of U.S. News, we were always asking, what's the real conversation going on at the dinner tables around America? It's not what we read in the press. What's really people care about? What are they really talking about? And you had to sort of listen for that. And if we wrote about that, then our magazines went off the newsstands. They flew off the newsstands. If we sat back in our little ivory towers and tried to figure out what they should be talking about or what was in the newspaper, sales went to hell. You really had to be sort of engaged in what is that other conversation. And you can see that with leaders again and again, and trying to understand what the other person is saying. That it was one of the most striking instances. If you read Mandela's biography, read the Rick Stengel biography, which is out now. Rick works, he used to be editor of Time magazine, works at the State Department now as undersecretary. But he has a short and very poignant biography of Mandela. But he talks about how Mandela, when he was in prison at Robben Island, and had his prison guards were Boers. They were white Boers, and they were like his enemy. And what he did was he spent lots and lots of time reading about their history, who they were, what they believed in, what their grievances were. And over time, he developed an understanding and an empathy for them, and gradually, he became their leader. They were his prisoners. I mean, they were his guards, and and they came to him for, what should we do now? It was absolutely remarkable, but it came through that sense of empathy. I thought that Deepak's last line today in this morning's session, when his conclusion was, look at the world through gentler eyes. Look at the world through gentler eyes, was really powerful. I really thought, I think those words, look at the world through gentler eyes, made a real impact on me. Number 4 is judgment. It is extraordinarily important to the quality of any leader, because ultimately decision making is about judgment. And a lot of studies have been made about decision making. Max Beserman is one of the leaders in this field, and his Behavioral Insights group, of course, has been a dramatic part of what CPL is coming, has become. But it's hard to know how to capture this, and hard to know how to teach it, but I will tell you something. If you go down and have an opportunity to look at the 13 Days exhibit, and then read what Ted Sorensen said when he came to the Kennedy School, he was at the IOP, and it's a long talk about Kennedy's judgment in 13 days. It's a magnificent essay about what judgment is, what aspects of it take into account. And I would urge you, I think it's one of the finest things that's come out of the Kennedy School. It's hard to get, but sometimes the best things are out of print, right? And it's just understanding what went into that. And remember that picture we saw today with Deepak of Bobby and Jack Kennedy there talking? And another part of that story was what informed Jack Kennedy's judgment was Bobby. And Bobby was, when they first reached a consensus to go bomb, which was, as Deepak said today, exactly what they were planning to do, they then started swerving out. They reconsidered that first consensus, and it was Bobby who started making the argument that we should not do a Pearl Harbor in reverse. We shouldn't go off and bomb the Cubans. You know, as we got bombed in Pearl Harbor, we're going to lose our moral ground. And what's important about that was that so often we talk about how if you're an organization, you need to speak truth to leaders. That's absolutely right. But you also need to learn how to speak conscience to leaders. And that was what was going on with Bobby, and it really made a big, big difference in the conversations, and it made a big difference in the final outcome. Now, number 3, coming down the home stretch. Humor. Humor. You may not think that's important. I think it's essential for the running of a good government and the running of a good organization. You have to have the capacity with your team to stand back and see the humor in things, see how comic life really is, and to enjoy those moments together, because it really, it bonds people, but it also gives you some perspective so you don't take yourself, you take the issue seriously, but not yourself, and that's important. I used to pal around with Pierre Salinger before he died, and you know he was a press secretary for Jack Kennedy. And he liked to tell the story of when he was Pierre was in his office in the West Wing one morning, and the phone rang, and it was the president. And the president said, "Pierre, come in here, I need to talk to you." I said, "Yes, sir." He walked in the Oval Office. "Pierre, I know you love a good cigar just as much as I do." "Yes, sir, Mr. President." "Well, Pierre, I've got a favor to ask." "Well, what's that?" "Pierre, I need you to get me some of Havana's finest cigars." "Well, Mr. President, Havana cigars not easy to come by. How many do you need, and how soon do you need them?" "I need 1,000, and I need them by 11 o'clock tomorrow morning." "Mr. President, I'm not sure." "Pierre, you're a good man. See you later." Next day, 11 o'clock, phone rings. "Pierre, come in here." He walks in. "Pierre, did you get those cigars?" "Yes, sir, Mr. President, all 1,000 of Havana's finest cigars." "I knew you were a good man, Pierre. See you later." Noon sharp, the President of the United States went on national television to declare a trade embargo against Cuba. That's someone with a sense of humor, right? Someone with a sense of humor. Deepak talked about Jim Baker today, and his judgment, and Jim was a mentor of mine, and the kind of things he did with me was what I would like to pass on to you. He just sort of expected things of you. He tried to lift you up as best he could, but he knew it was going to be up to you to a large extent. But he had a terrific sense of humor, at least he did most of the time. But I do remember when Mike Deaver and I did this to him, but he went out and had a cardiology exam. And when he came back, we decided, well, maybe we can have a little fun here. So at that time in the White House, they had a taping system that the White House military ran, Walker ran, White House Communications Agency it was called. And so you could call up CBS News or NBC News that was on the night before, even that night, and get a replay right there into your office. And you just pick up the phone and do it. It was sort of an early breakthrough in technology. So we went to Leslie Stahl, Mike and I went to Leslie Stahl and said, "Leslie, we want you to do something. Would you make a special piece from the White House lawn about Jim Baker and his visit to the cardiologist. And she had a good sense of humor too, so she made this 3-minute report saying CBS News has learned that Jim Baker has seen his cardiologist, and and then she had pictures of somebody being all wired up and everything like that. And the cardiologist has sent a secret report to the President of the United States to inform him that his chief of staff has a serious heart problem. And the President is about to ask for Jim Baker's resignation. That was the piece. So we got this piece all made up, and then Baker went out to some reception, and it was, about, and I think it was Walter Cronkite, whoever came on at 6:30. So the piece was done. We called Baker at about 7 o'clock and said, Jim, you got to come back to the White House. There's been something on TV tonight you just got to see. Would you please get over here just as soon as you can? He comes whizzing back in there. We put him down in the room. We turn on we'll call Walker. We put that piece on the air. He goes ashen. The guy's down there going to die, because he looks at this and, and it took about 4 or 5 minutes, and he realized, I can't believe you did that to me. And so he was really ticked off, but he thought it was in good humor. So Baker also knew that revenge is best served cold. And so Leslie's contract was coming up about 2 months later, and he called the president of CBS News and said, I've got a favor to ask you, and he explained what happened. And so Leslie went up to Black Rock to begin her contract negotiations. The president of CBS called her in and said, Leslie, I've heard about what happened with you and Jim Baker, and you're way over the line. That just does not happen at CBS. I'm afraid we can't renew your contract. And of course, she went nuts. I mean, Jim erupting is one thing. Seeing Leslie Stahl erupt is like a completely different situation. And she went crazy, but it took her about 3 or 4 minutes. And she called Baker and said, okay, you got me. But it was good. But that made a big difference in our lives. Having that kind of set of relationships, was really important. And I think humor is underrated and extremely important. It keeps things going at times you wouldn't expect. Number 2, resilience. This is a phrase that has become very popular right now. Judith Rodin, who is the head of the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, has just written a book about resilience of individuals as well as institutions. Here in New England, people used to call it the need for hardiness. In tough times, the Brits used to talk about nerve or stiff upper lip, and we had even going all the way back to the days of Rome. The Greek Epictetus wrote about the importance of stoicism. Whatever you want to call it, the capacity to get knocked down and stand back up is really important in your lives. Many of you have not had failure yet. You will not be looking for failure, but failure will find you at some point along the way. And it may find you several times. If you read biographies closely, what you'll find is the people you most admire failed many, many times more than anybody appreciates. And they had to have a capacity to deal with it. And we heard from Mara today about how difficult it's been at the VA just to get up in the morning at 5 o'clock and read those first newspapers and see, and feel like you're getting beaten up, right? And that happens. We used to have an old saying, one of the White Houses, that that the higher up a monkey climbs the tree, the more you see of its rear end. And there's a tendency for people to think about that when they're in the press and they're in the social media today especially, and to go after you in ways that are vicious. I can't tell you the number of public people I know. Colin Powell, he and I have talked about this, and he is stunned when he opens up his emails and his social media in the morning to see a lot of good things that are coming are interesting, but the number of people who just dump all over him in a vicious way and sort of threaten his life or threaten his future is unbelievable. And if it's happening to Colin Powell, just think how much worse it is for a lot of other people. You just have to come to grips with it, and you have to deal with getting knocked down and trying to get back up. Listen, when I went to work for Bill Clinton in the White House, I'd worked for 3 Republican presidents. And I'd known President Clinton for a long time personally, and his family and that sort of thing. And he asked me to come in and join him about 6 months in. He was floundering a little bit. He got his feet back up under him. And there was a fellow named Michael Kelly who was a journalist who had written a very unflattering profile of Hillary Clinton in the New York Times Sunday magazine. Had also written an unflattering profile of Bill Clinton in the same magazine, and he came to me and said, I'd like to do your profile. And I went to see the Clintons and talk about it and said, what do you think? And they said, well, we'd probably advise you against it. And I thought, well, I've been around this town a lot longer than they have. I can handle this and I can deal with it and it'll be fine. And he wrote a cover package in the New York Times Sunday magazine, the Ann will remember well. It was called The Master of the Game, and it was like a killer piece. I mean, he regarded me as a rank opportunist to go to work for Bill Clinton after working for Republicans. This was all about, my personal ambition and my, manipulating the system and so forth and so on. I didn't want to be in public for about 2 weeks. I mean, I really felt awful. Yeah, I felt I've never been portrayed in this way, and I thought it was extraordinarily unfair. And eventually, he apologized to me later in life before he died. But it was like it just really knocked me for a loop. And it took a while, but what I realized, I started running into people who said, wow, I saw your profile in the New York Times Sunday magazine. That's really impressive. And I looked at that piece, I was like, wow, you were treated so well. What are you talking about? Nobody read it? You never guys had no. And it was like I was stunned. And eventually it all went away. And so, a very dear mentor of mine told me, look, if they're starting to go after you and they're not taking your children away and you're not going to jail, don't worry about it. It's going to pass. It will pass. Those newspapers will eventually be on the bottom of a birdcage somewhere. Don't get too hung up about that. And it helped me a lot to realize, coming back from playing on the Chicago Black Sox to going through that New York Times piece, that there is life after. You just have to, you gotta tough it out sometimes, but you've got to be resilient. Don't forget who you are. Have faith in your mission. Keep going. Just keep going. If you can keep a smile on your face, people are going to be even more impressed. They're going to say, wow, that person really got knocked down. Look at that. They're still smiling. And ultimately, I will tell you, I have come to believe that I don't want to entrust leadership in a big organization, especially the presidency, to anybody who has not been knocked down. I don't know if they can take it. I don't know if they may be a hemophiliac. One big blow to the chin and they may bleed to death. You don't know. Some people can't take it, and it's really important to realize that actually the people who got knocked down a couple times are one heck of a lot stronger than you may think, and they know how to survive and move on. Finally, I'd like to talk just a bit about courage. It is an extraordinarily important part of life, and it is one of the ones that, Winston Churchill, he said, courage is rightly esteemed the first of human qualities because it is the quality that guarantees all others. I'm not sure I'd go that far. I think integrity still is more important than courage, but I do believe that courage is essential to leadership in a very changing world in which you can take so much flack as you do, especially when you challenge the status quo. I watch any number of now nonprofit organizations and the leaders of those organizations. Linda Mason, I think probably, who's been so terrific at this, I think with Mercy Corps didn't run into this, but there are a number of people who in the nonprofit world and also in the governmental world that, the more successful you are, the more you get knocked. And it can get really, really tough. And you've got to have, I think, both physical courage and moral courage. The physical courage is something that we heard about from Seth today. Talking to Seth about, what he learned when he was there as a lieutenant. And what he understood was, he talked to me once about when a sniper started taking out his troops, and they were hiding, he and his troops were hiding behind a berm, and the sniper was about 150 to 200 yards off. And they had to go attack the sniper in this house where he was. And so Seth at first thought, I'll order the people up over the berm and they'll charge. But he realized my enlisted guys are not going to go over that berm unless I go. I've got to go first. And he had to climb up that little hill and go for it, 150 yards. And what you do is you shoot, you go down, you crawl, you go up, you run, you go down, and you keep going like that. He had to lead that group. And I think that's one of the things he got a badge of heroism about. And like a good Marine, he doesn't talk about it. You know, one of the most interesting things about his campaign was when the Boston Globe went after his records and his 4 tours in Iraq, and they thought he'd overstated what he'd done maybe, and they wanted to check, as so many people have done in politics. They got a hold of his records and turned out he'd understated. He never mentioned in his campaign that he had two medals for heroism. And as it turned out, he never even talked to his parents about it. They didn't know. I didn't know. I knew him pretty well. But he felt, you know, that's what we do. My enlisted people deserve this as much as I did. That's what I mean by courage. I thought he had both physical courage and moral courage. And I must say, I think that about so many of you, that I have such respect for what you're doing. I think what you're about is sort of noble work. Zach and I were talking a little while ago, and he talked about sort of the noble work coming out of the Kennedy School and coming out of people in these fellowships. So I salute you for that. I respect you for it. I hope that you'll have continual growth on some of these issues. I hope we can be of service to you. And you have no idea how much I'm counting on your generation to pull this country and pull the world back on track. I just think you've got enormous promise in that regard, and I appreciate you listening tonight. Thank you very, very much. Drafted by these good folks, and so I'm happy to talk to you for a little while. I don't want to bore you in the hours late, and I know we have some dancing, and the bar will be open here in just a short while. As you heard from Katie, I have been around a rather long time. Some of my critics think way too long, but I've gotten to a stage in life right now where I'm very sympathetic with an old fellow who was walking through the woods one day, and he heard this sound, and he couldn't see anything, and then he heard it again and looked down, and there was a frog by the side of the path, and the frog looked up at him and said, "If you kiss me, I'll turn into a beautiful princess." And he said, "Wow, that's terrific." Reached down, scoops up the frog, puts it in his pocket, no kiss. Well, the frog's very surprised, crawls up his jacket. "Didn't you hear me? I said, if you kiss me, I'll turn into a beautiful princess." "Yeah, I heard you all right, but at my age, I'd rather have a talking frog." That's sort of where I am in life right now. And most of the people I see in politics look like frogs anyway. So it's, with a great glowing exception of Seth Moulton, of course, who was on the front page of the Boston Globe, even as we met today at lunch there with Seth, a big story, great big picture of him. You know, he came back from Afghanistan and Iraq to be with us. He flew overnight to be. Thank you, that was terrific. Katie, she was too modest to say that we met when she was on the Duke board. She came out shortly after graduation, and they select one person to come out from a class and represent the whole class on the board of trustees, and there she was. And she spoke up, and I really was quite struck by how much she added. Graves, thank you for your introductions and your thank yous to all the people here. I told you I would not poke fun at you, any more fun at Princeton, but for a Princeton guy, you did pretty well. I also want to say, among all the many thank yous that are due here tonight, and I share all the ones that Graves mentioned. I'd like also to recognize my co-director, Max Bazerman, and his wife, Marla. Would you all stand, please? Max has been an extraordinary addition to the Kennedy School. Coming from the business school, he has a joint appointment now to the two, but he's lent himself in such magnificent ways to the center. We could not have made the progress that we have were it not for Max, and indeed for the addition of Patty Bellinger as our executive director. Many of you met Patty. She was not able, she's on her way to San Francisco tonight, but she was here earlier today. And I can just tell you that so much of what we have done in the last couple of years has been due to them coming in and strengthening our entire operation, strengthening our team. We have a wonderful team, as you've seen. And to be honest with you, also gives me great assurances that the center will be in good hands for many years to come. And that's very important to us as we go forward with our work. So thank you, Max. And you've actually lent me a little intellectual credibility, not much, but some. And I appreciate that. I do want to apologize for Madeleine Albright, her inability to be here tonight. We talked last night. She was extremely sorry she couldn't join us. But she promised us she would she promised us a rain check. So we have a chit that's in safekeeping. Archon, you can look after that. Maybe we can get her to come up and be a graduation speaker, or we'll do something. Well, if nothing else, we'll get her to come up and raise money, right? We're on the constant hunt. But in any event, I was not looking to do this, but I got dragged with us. And so we're deeply grateful to him, and of course proud of him, as we are so proud of all of you. I wasn't quite sure what to do tonight. It would be, quote, my leadership journey. What I thought might be helpful or interesting, I don't know if it'd be interesting or not, but what I'd like to do is to take off on the conversation that Dean Williams was having with the panel, at lunchtime today. And he first asked him, what is if you had to use one cuss word, what would it be? And we all sort of booed him off the stage on that. So then he asked, okay, if you had to have one word about leadership, about a quality of leadership, what would it be? So what I'd like to do is take off on that. There were 3 that we heard today, and then I'm going to trot out 7 more that matter to me in my leadership journey. So I want to give you the top 10. And let's start with where Mara was today at lunch. She said persistence, right? That was where you started. And I thought that is an insight of somebody who's actually been out in the arena and understands how hard change is. Historically, people who have written the best books about politics and society, start with Machiavelli, famously said how hard change was. And that is because there are some people who benefit from the status quo and they're going to resist it. And there are other people who would benefit from change, but they're scared of it. And when you put those together, it's really hard to overcome that and mobilize people behind it. And it is, I think what you're going to find in life, as I have found, is the kind of changes that you want to see don't happen with the kind of speed that you'd like to see them. I was very involved in civil rights when I was young, and I just felt for sure by the time I died that this country would address racism, and that we not only would address racism, but that African Americans would have an equal shot in life. And here we are, years later, when neither of those propositions is true. And so, and that's been a great disappointment to me as a white Southerner. But there we are. Now, what I would say, though, is this, and the good news is this: when change starts, it may be slow when it starts, but then it can come very quick. And there's no better example of this than our good friend Brian Elliott. So many of you remember him as one of the fellows here. And when Brian was passionate about gay rights when he was here on the Kennedy School campus. We spent a lot of time talking together. And when he went out, he formed his own organization to deal with that. And they made magnificent progress. What's